A few weeks ago, I published a video on YouTube about how I parse a complex JSON and convert it into CSV and save it into SharePoint. I put the link to that video right there. Take a look if you haven't watched it. That's something that is worth watching. But at the same time, the question that came to me was, how can we use Parse JSON? Instead of going through all those complexities and writing expressions, can we directly use Parse JSON? The answer is yes, you can use Parse JSON, but it is not as simple as you think. So this video is not going to show you how to parse that complex JSON using Parse JSON action. But in this video, I want to go through the advantages and disadvantages of using Parse JSON. And at the end, I'm going to parse the same complex JSON using Parse JSON and do it in a proper and efficient way. So as much as I want to say Parse JSON is very helpful, but if you don't know the limitations and restrictions that comes with it, probably you will end up with a little bit of trouble that I will go through it in the first section of this video. So first, we go through the Parse JSON, what it can do and what it cannot do, and then we actually put it into practice to parse the same complex JSON file that I put the link in the description. You can download it and follow me, but in no form or shape I can recommend doing it that way. So consider the second part of this video as just a practice to learn and understand Parse JSON, not as a way to really implement it. The right way to implement it is what you saw in the video a few weeks ago. So now let's get into it and go through the inside out of JSON and Parse JSON action inside Power Automate. Ready for that? Let's start by a quick introduction into Parse JSON. To start with, we go to flow.microsoft.com and I create a flow. Just make it full screen. All right. And I create an instant flow that we can fire it by pushing a button. So I call it Parse JSON demo, and I click manually trigger a flow, and we create it. I create a variable, and I want to put the JSON object inside it. So I click on initialize variable, and I give it a name called sample JSON. I'd rather have it one word. The type is going to be either object or string. Both ways works. I pick object, and the value that I want to put inside it is a value that I've already created. It's a very simple JSON object. This simple object has a few properties inside it: first name, last name, email, course, and enrollment fee. So I just copy and paste this inside the value of this variable. And that's it. So right after that, I save it. And now we want to work with the elements inside it. So what Parse JSON does is that it navigates through all these elements and gives us a visual representation of this JSON. So assuming that these are the values that we receive dynamically. So although we have first name, last name, email, course, and enrollment fee, just like this format or this schema of JSON, the value of the first name, last name, email, and all those things can be different depending on the content that we are requesting. With Parse JSON, we have the option to convert this into a visual representation that we can visually work with it. Let's see how it works. I add the new step and I add Parse JSON here. And the content is coming from initialize variable sample JSON. Now, for this guy to work and really parse, it requires a schema. And the schema is basically the way that the data is organized. Somehow we need to tell this Parse JSON that the content that we receive has first name, last name, email, course, and enrollment. So For that, I need to give this guy a sample of the data so it can generate the schema for the JSON. So I click on the schema. While I got a copy of this sample data, I click on generate from sample, and this control has the option that can capture a JSON sample and try to guesswork the fields and the data types that are coming from there. So as you can see, first name is a string, last name is a string, email is string, course is going to be a string, while enrollment fee is integer. Of course, we can go there and make changes and update it manually, but assuming that we are using Parse JSON, we are trying to stay away from coding and writing expressions. So what happens after we parse this JSON using this schema? From now on, any JSON content that has this schema, that has first name, last name, email, course, and enrollment fee, will be parsed by this action. And now we can have a visual representation. So imagine if I want to, for example, send an email, and that email, I'm going to send it to myself. Subject is going to be JSON fields. And the body of the message is going to have some fields from this JSON object. As you can see now, Parse JSON represents first name, last name, email, and the course. This is great because now, instead of really writing expressions and pointing to the elements, I can directly click on every single one of the properties in this JSON and bring it back to email. So for example, I can say first name, and I can click on first name or last name. I can click on last name. Now I can save it and run it. And even if I go here and instead of Ali Raza, I change the name to James, and I click on save, I can test it. And let's see what happens. That's fine. Continue and run flow done. Email is sent. So let's go back to Outlook. And this is the message that I got. First name James, last name Ali. But as you can see, now when I'm here inside this flow, I'm not working with writing expressions that they can actually refer to these elements. This is fantastic. So if this is the case, all we need to do, we just get a sample of the JSON object, pass it to Parse JSON, create a schema, and then visually deal with it, and we really don't need to learn JSON. Probably it is not that accurate. So let me show you another example. I go to another JSON sample that I've already created, and it's called person. I created this Sacha Baron Cohen object for the JSON crash course, and it's an example of an object with first name, last name, date of birth. Now, there is a spouse here, and that spouse has first name, last name, age, and all the other information. So it's not very straightforward one-level object. Let's take this object and pass it to our flow. So I just paste this guy here. Of course, I need to update the schema for the parse JSON. So I click on generate from sample, and this time I copy the new sample of the data. I click on done. Fantastic, it worked. So I don't have this first name, last name here now. Let me add the information here again. Now here is the mess that you have. You have first name and you have another first name. You have last name, you have another last. Oh God. Now, which one is the first name of the actual object and which one is the first name of the spouse? Just see this. You have the first name and you have another first name in the second layer. And when it brings it to the visual UI, basically it turns both of them to first name. And it is a little bit confusing unless you really dig into the details of it, that this is not a place that I want to go through it. So yeah, it works, but most of the time it is just good enough for plain simple objects. But it's not really that bad. let's assume that we only want the first name, last name, and date of birth of the main object. We really don't care about the spouse, children, and all those stuff. We only want first name, last name, date of birth, and if this guy is married. To do that, although we receive this object, I can simplify this object. So let me copy this again and bring it to Visual Studio Code. Let me just create a new file here, and I just paste this guy here. So this one, I don't need the spouse, I just take it out. I don't need children, I just take it out. I don't need the pet name, so I just take it out. So basically, this is the simplified version of that object that represents only the fields that I need. If I just copy this and pass it to my parse JSON here to generate the schema, I just pasted it here and I click on done. Okay, some extra comma, done, and we're happy with this. As you can see now, I provide an object which has a lot more elements than the schema. But this object actually contains every element that the schema needs to process. Parse JSON using the schema simply ignores everything else and gives us only the elements that they are defined inside the schema. This is great. So I can simply come back here now, and for the first name, when I click on here, you see only first name, last name, date of birth. I click on first name. I want to add last name here. What other fields did we have? We had maybe married. So let me get back here, and I call it is married. And of course, here I need to type it, married. And I click on save. I can test it now. Test. Run flow. Done. It is done. Let me go back to my mailbox, and this is what I get. Sasha Baron Cohen and is married, true. This is great. So basically, we can actually use Parse JSON to simplify a complex JSON object and only get the fields that we need. So let's review. We learned that we can use Parse JSON to get a visual representation of a valid JSON object. The way that it works is that Parse JSON creates a schema. That this schema is created based on the data payload that you provided to Parse JSON as a sample data so that it can recognize the schema right in the beginning. Then after that, whatever the values that they come here, as long as the JSON that we receive contains all the fields that the Parse JSON has it in its schema, it's all good. We can also use it to simplify a JSON object for our visual UI. So it's something really good as long as we know how to use it properly. Okay. So far, we learned that Parse JSON is good, but probably is not as good as you were expecting. It's good for simple queries, for simple JSON objects, but definitely not for something complex as we expected. Now let's see how we can break that complex JSON and make it into something smaller that can be processed using Parse JSON. Also keep it as a practice to convert the JSON file to Excel. But again, this is not the proper way of doing it, although it works. For the second part of this video, I want to refer you to this file that I put a link in the description. You can download the file in case you want to follow me. So this file is a complex JSON that I got from one of my students on Udemy, and I created the other video using the same file, but then the request was how can we use Parse JSON to parse this and convert it into an Excel sheet. This time it's a little bit different. So this time I want to use an apply to each, and I want to navigate through every single invoices, and I want to put it in an Excel file, not a CSV the way that I did before. Let's start by creating the Excel sheet. This is the Excel sheet that I have. I have invoice type, invoice ID, invoice number, amount paid, and the contact name. Now, if you see the JSON file, this is a fairly big file. But ID, status, provider name, and all those things that I really don't care about them, what I need is invoices. And invoices has type, ID, invoice number, blah, blah, blah. And I just need a few of these fields, but one of them that I need is the contact name, which is the second layer under the contact. So it's not straightforward. These complexities should give us enough practice to use Parse JSON action properly. Now, let's start the work by creating a new Power Automate flow. If I go to flow.microsoft.com, I click on Create, and I want to create a new instant flow, and I want to call it Parse JSON Complex Demo. And manually trigger a flow, and I click on Create, and my flow is created. I create a variable, initialize variable, and I call it complex JSON. And the type is going to be an object. For the value, I get the entire thing, Control A, Control C, and I paste it here. It's going to take a while. So I scroll up to the top of the page, close, and I want to create another variable, which is going to be an array. And this variable is going to contain invoices. Let me rename it to initialize invoices. And the name of this variable is going to be invoices, and the type is going to be an array. So I have one variable called complex JSON. Let me get the name of this variable. I need it. And I want to get the values from this variable. And only the invoices should come into this variable, which is an array. So I click on the values. To capture the invoices, I need to write a little bit of expression. There is no way around it. So I come back here and I click on expression and I just type variables, open the bracket, single quote, and inside it I put the name of the other variable, which was complex JSON. And right after that, I write the name of the property that I want to pick from there, which is invoices. I click on OK, and I have the list of all the invoices in this variable called invoices, and I really don't need to go back to this initialize variable anymore. Now that I have the content in an array, I can loop through every single one of these elements using apply to each control. So I click on add action and I type apply to each. This apply to each needs to get the values from this array. So click on it and I need to get the values from invoices. So now when this apply to each works, every single item in the loop is one invoice that I can perfectly work with that. So we came down from this complex object with tons of elements inside it to just one object that we need to process at a time. Only this much is the scope of our work. Classic example of divide and conquer. Now I can use Parse JSON to get the elements that I need. So add an action, and I want to use Parse JSON. The content should come from every single item of this apply to each. To do that, scroll down on the right side of the page to the very bottom. You will find the apply to each current item. Now we need to provide the schema. Let's go back to the old trick that we just learned. So I go back to my text editor. I select one invoice, copy it, and I create a new file. Paste. And I only get the values that I need. I need type, invoice ID, invoice number, reference, I don't need that. Payments, I don't need that. Credit notes, all these things, I don't need that. Amount paid, yes, I do need it. Amount credited is discounted, has attachments, all those things are not needed. Contact, I need it, but not all of it. I don't need contact ID, I just need the contact name, and I get rid of the rest of it. Just make sure you're following the clean format for a JSON object. I just remove the comma and make sure you close the curly bracket of the entire object. So I have one object, I have a few properties, one of the properties is an object, and it is enclosed by a curly bracket, which perfectly matches. Keep in mind, we only left the fields that we needed here. We didn't add anything here. Copy. And now this is my data payload to create the schema. Go back to flow, generate from sample, and I just copy and paste my data payload here, click on done, and a very simple schema is created. Great. Now that I have the fields, I can work with it visually. But we decided that we want to put these values in an Excel sheet. So before we put it inside an Excel sheet, let's go and create that Excel sheet. The Excel sheet that I created has one row only. To be able to work with it, we need to convert it to a table. So I select all of them and I say format as table. Doesn't matter which one you pick. Just make sure you say my table has headers and I click on OK. So a table is created. And it's a good idea to select it, click on design, and give it a name and call it invoices. And I click on save. Inside SharePoint, I have a library called testlib1, and I just upload the file, which is called invoices demo, drag and drop, and I put it inside SharePoint. I guess I put it in the wrong place. Yep, I put it under folder C, which is fine. Site folder C, I only have invoices demo. That's great. So I go back here, and now I can connect to that Excel sheet and insert every single row inside that table. Add an action, and I select Excel Online, and I use add row into a table. Click. I pick up the SharePoint site, which is called Power Automate Workshop. The document library is called testlib01. The file, I need to pick it up. Remember, we put it under folder C. Let me expand it. And invoices demo is there. Now I can pick up the table, which is called invoices. As soon as I select it, it shows me all the fields. Now you can see the beauty of Parse JSON. Invoice type, I can pick type from Parse JSON visually. Invoice ID, I can pick invoice ID. Invoice number, I have invoice number. Amount paid, I can use amount paid. And finally, contact name is represented here as name. Remember, Parse JSON just makes everything flat. This is your responsibility to know that where this field is coming from. And if I take you to the data payload again, you see that name is actually the contact name. So it is fair to say we can feed it to the contact name here. Believe it or not, we are done. Let me just save it and we run it. If you're following right after, you click on save and test and you click on continue and run flow. Done. And it takes a while to complete. You can comfortably go grab a coffee and come back after like maybe 2 to 3 minutes. I fast forward this video. All right, after almost 2.5 minutes, it's complete. Let's go back to SharePoint, open the file and see if we got the content inside it. And Here we go. We have the invoice type, invoice ID, invoice number, amount paid, and the contact name from that complex JSON. I just want to bring your attention to how long it took for this job to complete. If you have seen the other video, you can somehow get an idea that why I'm leaning towards the other solution rather than using an apply to each or any solution like that. And that's just one small reason that I don't like this solution. Still, it's a good practice. Do it. It gives you quite confident working with Parse JSON. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, push that like button so that I know you like that video. And it also gives me an idea that what kind of videos I want to put in my pipeline for the future productions. Thank you again. Stay tuned till the next video.